This video is going to focus a little bit on the checks that the other branches have against the judicial branch. Talked about the fact that there aren't a whole lot of rules and regulations in the Constitution that kind of guard against abuse of power by the judicial branch. Founding fathers kind of underestimated how powerful the judicial branch could be in the future, but it is important to know that there are some checks. So we're going to start with Congress first. So we talked a lot about, if you look at Amy Coney Barrett in the upper left-hand corner, the fact that it's the Senate's responsibility to approve or confirm all of a president's judicial nominees to the federal court system, including the Supreme Court. So it takes a majority of the Senate, 51 at minimum, to basically agree for an appointed judge to actually get their job. So they kind of have the last say on a president's nominations. So that gives the Senate a lot of power, right? Presidents have to take into consideration, what the composition is of the Senate when they make their nominees, right? The other major thing that the Senate can do is the Senate can propose, or Congress as a whole can propose amendments, not just the Senate. So, for example, amendments trump Supreme Court decisions. So it's important to know that. There are only really two ways you can undo a Supreme Court decision. So, for example, in 1989, the Supreme Court ruled in Texas v. Johnson that individuals have a right to burn a flag as a form of political protest, so that you can't be punished for burning a flag if you're doing so to express a political opinion. There are a lot of people that disagree with that decision. So there's only two ways that you can get rid of the Texas v. Johnson decision in 1989. First is, all these years later, the Supreme Court could hear a similar case and just rule differently. So they ruled that, they hear a similar case and they just decide in 2024 that you can't burn a flag. It's not protected speech. So the Supreme Court can undo its own decisions by ruling differently in a similar case. Or the Congress could pass an amendment. An amendment undoes a Supreme Court decision. So if Congress adds a new amendment to the Constitution that says you can't burn a flag, then that new amendment would cancel out Texas v. Johnson. And obviously, if you see on the left here side here, Congress is responsible, as we've talked about throughout the year, as getting the ball rolling with an amendment, right? So these are ways you could check the power of the Supreme Court. More extreme, Congress also has the ability to impeach federal judges. Just like they can impeach the president, and we've talked about that already, Congress can also impeach a federal judge, including a Supreme Court justice, right? So it's the same process. The House of Representatives would vote to do the impeachment, meaning make them stand trial. That takes a majority. And then the Senate would actually hold a trial and determine if that individual is guilty or innocent of whatever the House accused that person of doing. Over the course of American history, 15 total federal judges have been impeached, and 8 of them have been convicted. All the convictions have been in lower courts. We've never actually had a Supreme Court judge impeached and convicted. We had one Supreme Court judge impeached way back in 1805. His name was Samuel Chase, but he was found not guilty in his trial by the Senate. So again, the impeachment process and the trial also works for members of the federal court system. This is a pretty extreme step that Congress could do to check the power of an individual judge that was abusing their power. All right, and then executively, these are the checks that branch has against the judicial branch. So again, it is the president that fills the vacancies within the court. Again, that's a picture in the upper left-hand corner of former President Trump nominating Amy Coney Barrett, right? So obviously that gives the president some power and some sway over these individuals. Obviously, these judges are going to feel pretty loyal to the president that nominated them. So that gives the executive branch some power over the judicial branch. The other thing, obviously, we've talked about this all year, the president can use the bully pulpit to push Congress into doing its activities. So whether that is approving a president's nominee or to get the ball rolling on an amendment, right? We talked about those in the previous slide. The president can apply pressure to Congress to do those things, right? So informally, right, the bully pulpit could also then be used as a check on the judicial branch. And the last thing, this is pretty extreme, is that a president would also be able to just simply ignore a decision made by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, right, depends on the executive branch to enforce their decisions. But what happens when the executive branch just refuses to do that? So a famous example, what the bottom cartoon in the left represents, is in the late 1820s, early 1830s, the Cherokee had actually filed a lawsuit for the right to stay on their land in Georgia. And in a major triumph for the Cherokee, the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the Cherokee, basically saying that they could not be removed off of their land in Georgia, right? Unfortunately for the Cherokee, though, President Andrew Jackson at the time simply ignored the decision of the court and refused to enforce it. His famous line was like, "Justice Marshall has spoken, now let him enforce it," meaning the Supreme Court can't do anything, right? They depend on me and my branch to enforce the decision, and I disagree with it, so I'm not enforcing it. And in fact, he did the exact opposite. He ordered the Cherokee to be rounded up and marched out west to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, one of the darkest moments in American history. So it's pretty extreme, but if the executive branch disagreed with the Supreme Court ruling that much, they could potentially ignore it. So again, these are some of the major checks that the other branches have on the judicial branch.